Hi, I'm Karen Love, and I'm the Executive Director of the Dementia Action Alliance. We are a national organization in the United States creating a better world in which to live with dementia. And I am so excited today to have three icons in the field of dementia. I feel like we've gathered the three tenors together, a once in a lifetime. All three are members of the board. We have Susan Wehry, Teepa Snow, and Al Power. And we're just going to have a nice conversation today. And if you all wouldn't mind just doing a short introduction.
Which tenor should start?
Go ahead, Teepa.
I think you just have, Teepa. Take it away.
Well, hey, everybody, I'm Teepa Snow. I'm an occupational therapist with about 40 years of clinical experience, family experience, professional experience, and I have a company called Positive Approach to Care, and we do a lot of support and a lot of training and a lot of opportunities to see things in a different light.
Great. Hi. And I'm Susan Wehry. I'm a geriatric psychiatrist with almost 40 years Teepa, but closer to 35 years experience as a physician, who's been involved in various aspects of dementia care throughout my career. And I'm so thrilled to be here with the two of you because it seems that throughout my career, starting way back when we were breaking the bonds in the 1980s as part of the whole person-centered care movement, every place I went, people would say, "Do you know Al Power? You know Teepa Snow? You got to meet them. You guys are like so simpatico." And so I could not tell you how thrilled I am to have been invited to join the DAA board this year and to discover both of you on it. And now to be virtually, at least, at the same table, at the same time, in the same time space. It's really quite an honor to be here with both of you.
Thank you. And Al?
Power. I'm actually sitting in a kind of a dark office with an overcast sky, but I decided to just give myself a virtual background so I could cheer up a little bit. But it is really a thrill to be on with three icons in my mind around the world of changing people's mindset about what it's like to live with a diagnosis of dementia. I'm an internist and geriatrician, spent over 20 years working full-time in long-term care communities, and I have since been an independent consultant, educator, and author of a couple of books, including Dementia Beyond Drugs and Dementia Beyond Disease.
Each of you are passionate about making this a better world in which to live with dementia, and you're widely recognized globally for your work. How did you come to this passion and to become change agents?
Well, for me, it was accidental all the way. it was working in private practice for 7 years and working really hard and not seeing my family much, and seeing an ad to be an assistant medical director in a very large nursing home and thinking, gee, I never thought of that before, and having my colleagues in the hospital thinking I must have a drug problem to lead a successful practice and go work in long-term care, and then getting to love that, and then discovering the culture change movement that Susan referred to, and understanding that what I thought was great medical care was missing a lot of the boat, and working with organizations like the Eden Alternative, Pioneer Network, Greenhouse Project, and then learning how to apply some of the things I'd learned to the experience of living with dementia, and having that change my life all over again, and the demand for me to come out and talk, making me leave my job and enter a whole nother world I never expected to be doing 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah. You know, when I think about this, I have to go way back into childhood and recognize that I had the kind of upbringing, which, you know, had its pluses and minuses, but an upbringing that really stressed like the rightness and the wrongness in the world. And so I grew up with this strong advocacy streak for simple fairness. And the story that comes to mind just now, it hasn't for a long time, was that there was a boy in my neighborhood who had Down syndrome, and we were all getting ready to make our first communion. So you already know I grew up in a Catholic community. And it was something that brought the whole community together, certainly my family, source of pride. And this boy in my neighborhood wasn't being allowed to make his first communion because he had Down syndrome. And it seemed to me so fundamentally unfair. And so I discovered, like at age 7, this passion for fairness and for recognizing that differently abled people, as we often say, have a place and have a contribution. And that it became my mission at 7 to make sure that he could, in fact, make his first communion with us. And he did, because we had tutorials on the Baltimore Catechism. And frankly, that just comes to mind right now, because I sometimes ask myself, why do I have so much passion for this? And it really comes from a place of, in the beginning, a desire for a more socially just world. But then flash forward, and then it becomes really more about discovering my common humanity. And like Al, working in long-term care and recognizing very early on that there was a better way. So my whole career, I've worked with people who have been historically so-called marginalized, stigmatized, because I have seen and had the desire to have them in the tent with me, so to speak. And that's what comes to mind right now.
Thanks, Susan.
Teepa, I can't wait to hear your story.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Both of you triggered a lot of memories, and Karen's question did too. So much as Susan reported, some of my first experiences were very personal. My grandfather moved in when I was real young, and my mom was not a good caregiver. I mean, he had dementia, which we didn't realize till my grandma died. And we went to get him and be with him at the funeral. And we came back home from Cleveland to Pittsburgh, and we got a phone call from his apartment complex that he was breaking into apartments and messing with sinks and doing things because he still thought he was the superintendent of the apartments. And so we had to go and fetch him back. And he came to stay with me, but he was German and my mother was a phys ed teacher. And so it turned out that I could get him to stay with us better than she could do it, because she'd say, Dad, what part of Mom's dead do you not get? You can't go back. And he would say, don't tell me what I can't do. This is ridiculous. I'll drive home if I want to. And they'd get into arguments. And I'd say, well, Grandpa, if you leave, I'll be alone. And he'd say, well, I can stay one more day. And he stayed one more day until I went off to college. Because he had vascular dementia, which I had no idea. And when I was a teenager, I worked with kids with developmental disabilities who had been sent home to their families, once again, from the institutions that were closed, but they went in with autism and developmental disabilities because their parents were not good parents. The reason children had autism when I was young was that, quote unquote, mothers were cold mothers and they didn't know how to be good mothers. And that's why the little children got autism. And so they put them in institutions because that was going to be better. And within a very few years, they discovered that was not better. And so a group of righteous friends, similar, you know, there's a right and there's a wrong, got together and with a college kid had a Saturday respite program for these families that were overwhelmed. And we started holding groups for kids who had autism, mental health issues, physical health issues, and offered programs that now you would never be able to do that with kids. Right. But we were kids and we did it. And Michael, who was one of my kids, actually gave me the name that everybody knows and is now my legal name because my name was Tina, T-E-E-N-A. And Michael couldn't say Tina. He said, Teepa, tell me Toy. And so all my friends and family picked it up. And so gradually I eventually legally changed it.
Oh, Teepa, I love that story. And the other thing that just listening to you talk reminds me of another big influence in my life. And I have to just share it because when I was a young attending working on an inpatient psychiatric unit, which was part of the deinstitutionalization movement, right? So we're moving the people with acute psychiatric illness into general hospitals. And there I met a person I've never seen again, Mary McCarthy. I shout her out every time I remember, who was an occupational therapist. Mm-hmm. And I have often credited Mary McCarthy with teaching me more about how to be with people with serious and persistent mental illness than anything I had learned from any medical background. And just listening to the way you talk, it is to me at the heart of occupational therapy, and why I couldn't imagine doing this work without occupational therapists, because you bring to it that kind of can do, what do you need, this is what needs to happen, without a big focus on the diagnosis. It's more about the living your life. So thank you for that. I just love the way OTs think and talk. Don't you, Al?
Yeah, you know, Susan, what that triggers in me too, when you talk about the essence of what occupational therapists do, is really one of the great mindsets, I think, around dementia is to look at dementia more in the framework of a disability, a cognitive disability, instead of just a fatal disease. I mean, obviously there is disease or injury in the brain, but when you look at it through the social model of disability, when you look at it as what are the accommodations people need to continue to be successful, and then there's less stigma, there's more us changing to accommodate the needs of the person, like we do with other disabilities. And you used the term differently abled at the beginning. When you start to see people as people like everybody else who have different abilities, then you start finding solutions that aren't there when you just label people as having a disease that you know, everything they do or say is beyond their control because the disease makes them do it.
Yeah, here's the disease and you're behind the disease. And it's like, no, I'm always here, but you have to be willing to see me as I am, not as I was, but as I am right now, and support me where I am now. I mean, yeah, I mean, you can grieve my loss and I might too sometimes, but right now I'm living. How about we work on us living right now and not just worrying about, well, but I can't fix that. You got to let go of what you can't have in order to celebrate what's possible.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, well, all of you have talked about marginalized communities. How do you think society mostly views people with dementia, that they are dying from dementia or living with it? And why?
You know, I think that I think the dominant narrative around dementia unfortunately remains dying with. I think that so often, and I think this is often true when the medical diagnosis leaps to the forefront. And when you think about this as a disease, and I've heard folks at DAA talk about this, people who are living with dementia, that from the day you get the diagnosis, people treat it as a death sentence. And you're already told to like put your affairs in order, as if today is 15 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 8 years from now, whatever the period of time. So I think that what has dominated our conversation about people living with dementia is the tragedy narrative. As Teepa just said, there is a loss, there is something to be grieved, there is in every illness a challenge. But what leapt to the fore was the long goodbye, the forgetting, the end stage, and not the journey. And I think so oftentimes in a medical framework, we really do look to the worst end outcome as opposed to all of the living that's going to happen with that disease or with that condition or with that disability in the interim. So I think we're making headway. I think the whole nothing about us without us inspiration that we get from the entire disability community. I think that the person first language movement, to always be thinking about people with, not people who have, or not naming the disease as the person, have been positive contributors, but I think we have a ways to go.
And I see it a little differently. What I see is you're either in the dying or you're not yet bad enough. And I think there's still this desire to draw the line in the sand, that there's this line in the sand when we'll know that you can't be on this side anymore. So now you're going to go over and be on that other side. Mm-hmm. So there's this magic line, which historically has been the diagnosis. And I think now it's moving over to when we can tell that you have the symptoms of the diagnosis. So it's a little different than it used to be. So as long as you can act normal and cover and be okay, you can be on our side. Now, once you cross over and you're more of the when I go to try to you know, the what was I know the I can't, so when I can't produce language, when I can't behave myself, when I can't continue the back and forth as we anticipate, then I've crossed that line. And still, I believe at that point, this is where we talk about taking care of, being in charge of, having someone who will do for, and that's the dying process.
That's very interesting, Teepa. You know, I think that
we've moved the bar, but we haven't gotten rid of the fence. And
yes, I like
that. Let's just get rid of the fence. Why is there a fence?
Why is there a fence? I think that that is so true. And it reminds me of so many other stigmatizing or us, them kinds of
black and white, you know.
Exactly, it's can
like,
pass.
Well, they're like, we're all shades of color. So what's the deal here? You know, like, let's just not put the Carla bar up.
Exactly, exactly. Have you seen a similar evolution, Al?
Yeah, and the other thing about that, the other thing about crossing that line that Teepa talks about is that that's where, because of those things people see that bother them, that's where isolation really becomes rampant.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we put people in places where nobody else sees them, whether it be just staying at home and not taking people out in the community anymore, or putting people into locked living areas, and you know, and it becomes a shame, and many people live with dementia talk about feeling a sense of guilt or a sense of shame. Because they can't be
or
that.
Fear. I hope I never get there. What will happen when I get to that place, that scary place where I can't control me?
Yeah, there are a lot of studies that show that people, whether professional or family members, tend to underestimate the quality of life of people with dementia. Family members tend to do it based on their own impact, and the caregivers tend to do it based on people's functional level. But we tend to underestimate how well a person can live just based on our own views rather than seeing things through the person's eyes.
Oh, good point. So following on that, what changes would you like to see made in the U.S. so it's a better place for people and families to live with dementia?
Well, start with education, I guess. But there's a couple of caveats to that. First of all, the right kind of education, because there are education programs out there that actually promote stigma, promote the othering, and we have to make sure that we are good stewards as to the message that we are creating. And that's why a group like Dementia Action Alliance is so important as an advocate, because they really do help maintain that stewardship, as was recently done with a national gathering where some ideas were expressed. The other thing is that also DAA does so well is to include the voices of people living with a diagnosis in the conversation, because I believe there's no bigger stigma buster than to talk to a person with dementia. I still, Susan had her Mary McCarthy. My greatest teacher of dementia was not a med school professor. It was Dr. Richard Taylor, who lived with dementia, who I got to know, who I traveled with, spoke with, and hung out with. And I believe he's taught me more about dementia in a positive sense than anyone I ever studied with in my career. And I'm with Teepa. It'll be this month, 40 years since graduation. So there we are.
Go ahead, Susan. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with Al that it's education, and of the right kind. I think there is a lot of othering education. I like that phrase so much. And we can thank DAA for being a different voice and promoting a different kind of educational agenda. I think also that we have to take a really close look at our reform efforts in the way we support people who need perhaps more support at different stages of life, whether that's in congregate living or living in their own homes, wherever it is, so that it becomes a way of integrating rather than segregating. And, you know, Al alluded to this tendency we have to decide that the best way to handle people is to put them over here. And we create locked units. That's how they first get described. And then we say, well, that sounds a little harsh, so let's call them specialized memory care units, but we'll still keep the door locked.
So why are they called memory care?
Yes, well, that's a really
I
good
mean, let's keep
question.
emphasizing memory cafe, memory care. We keep emphasizing one of the hallmark signals that something's changing. We're going to keep poking you with it. I mean, and when we talk about education, one of the first tenets of education, I think, that I'm working really hard on is the idea of awareness first. We have so many people who are unaware that we have only been using a word, and I've heard every one of us use it, is the word dementia. And yet, the vast majority of people are still saying Alzheimer's or Alzheimer's and maybe some related dementias, but they won't or don't know the word dementia. And you don't typically hear hardly anybody saying neurocognitive degeneration or brain cell changes or, you know, brain changes that are consistent with, you know, some protein malformations, or we're not speaking in a language that separates what's happening in the brain with the changes of the person. And I think for me, that's a key piece, that we start recognizing it's change. Is it always just loss? No, it's the challenge of the retained ability combined with the loss that gives you what you don't like.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think that a lot of the whole culture change movement started by first focusing on the language, right? The way people who lived in long-term care were addressed. So that's a really good point to underscore, and the sort of awareness, being mindful of the language that we use, and continuing to look for better words, and to continue to ask people who are living with dementia, what best describes your experience? And I think that that's another you know, expansion or evolution of the way we work with this, to be looking in terms of disability language and using that framework, even more than the disease or the pathogenesis or the neurocognitive decline, is to say, you know, what do these changes in the brain do? Well, they accentuate some of our strengths and they show off some of our weaknesses. And so, just as you said, we have to bring those together so that the changing brain is supported in optimizing what still works well, to work around that which no longer does, as we would with any disability, right?
So yeah, the word I use is substitution, not subtraction. So we need to learn more about the art of substitution. So trying to take something away from someone always panics them. You can't have that, that's mine. And it's like, well, let's give you something else that might have some greater value to you. And then maybe you'll let go of that just because it's no longer as attractive. So when somebody says that demented person, and instead we go, so you're talking about the person who's living with dementia. We've offered a substitution.
Right,
We
exactly.
haven't argued with them, and we haven't said, that's not how we say it. And we also then, you know, that offers, so rather than global deterioration scale, I've offered up something called the GEM state, which is you're in a state at any moment in time. You, me, all of us go into GEM states, and it's just whatever state I'm in, that's the state I am. And when
You are an OT, aren't you?
I know. I mean,
you are an
occupational. Do it, and if you can't do it, let me look and see what I can do to support you doing something. If you want to do it, you know, what the heck? Why? If I don't have capacity, I don't. If I do, I will.
Yeah, exactly. Love it.
Different capacities for different things. I might not be able to sign a directive for surgery, but I can still decide what I want to eat that day, or decide that I don't want to engage in an activity. And I think we, once again, getting back to that black and white concept, we tend to think that if the person can't sign the healthcare directive, then we take all decisions away. You know, and once again, that's just missing the whole disability mindset. I wanted to just harken back to something Teepa said about you know, memory care. That first of all, I'll tell you, people I know, advocates living with dementia, hate that term, because they know that dementia is not just about memory. But I had a friend, colleague, Tammy Marshall, make the point that I'd never thought of before, that, you know, when you call a living area a memory care area, that's actually a violation of HIPAA, because you are telling you what's wrong, what's medically wrong with the people who live there. And you know, you'd never say, well, this is the place for people with diabetes, or this is the place, you know, for people that have this or that. So it not only,
well, at least you did say people with.
Yes, that's right.
This is the place for diabetics.
The problem is that I've worked so hard at this over the years that it's hard to say it wrong anymore, because you know, the word demented, it absolutely makes me cringe, and you still see it every day in the medical literature, in the media. Yeah, so I think a lot of that really talking about language, number one, it reflects how we see the world, but it also determines how we see the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so often when I do a seminar and people are just kind of overwhelmed and saying, where do I start? I often suggest that people just have a conversation about the language they use. And I've been called to help with some challenges in the past where you see all that kind of labeling language in the chart or in the rounding sheets. And so I'll sit down with the group and I'll say, okay, explain to me what the challenge is, but there's one rule. I don't want you to use any word to describe the person that you wouldn't want me to use to describe you or someone you love. And people become tongue-tied. They don't know how to say it without those words. And so it's, as Teepa said, the substitution idea, let's think about what's a way that could say it where you don't feel bad about the person. I mean, just behavior management. You know, I could come up with a
cringed on that one
the
for
nicest person
years.
in the world.
As you know.
Sit down, engage them, talk to them, and then say, hi, I'm a specialist. I'm here to help manage your behavior. Now, who have I got in mind? You know, your needs or somebody else's when I say that.
Yeah, so helping people see things as challenging situations rather than a problem behavior. And so the idea of, I've done that recently with a group. I said, okay, so they say, well, you know, she's just gotten aggressive. And I said, so she's in active distress. And they pause, there's this pause, and they go, well, yeah, I guess so. They've never ever stood on her side of it. Right. And looked at it from her perspective. So I use hands a lot because I'm an OT, I guess, and kinesthetic. And I have people go, okay, so this is you. So put your thumb up. And I have people do it because it helps. Okay, so go ahead and stick your thumbs up. This is you, and this is the person you're trying to help. And if you're not careful, what you try to do is tell them what you're going to do to help. And then when you try to help, unfortunately, because you're seeing it differently, you pinch one another. But maybe let's change and let's put ourselves beside the person. Let's try coming alongside them. So maybe we can promise that we could do it together. And when we do it together, it works a little better.
Oh, that's nice.
I like that.
So we seem to be, as a society, very much stuck on you know, not the framework of disability and what do we need to support you, starting from diagnosis. It's not as if, you know, with cancer and you get information and you get plugged into things. Why do you think there is a lack of proactivity of helping people right from the outset go in the right direction?
I think it's about the idea of the line. And the diagnosis routinely is not going to happen till there's so much evidence you're approaching that line that, ooh, I feel like I can't deny the lie anymore. I mean, the line's there. If it's me, I'm seeing so many signs within myself. Or if I'm not able to see those signs because of one of the potential areas of my brain not being very effective, which is the ability to be self-aware, I have anosognosia, if we want to use like a fancy term. What it means is the people around me have picked up on so many changes that they are fairly convinced. So there's already this going on. And one of us doesn't want it and the other one maybe doesn't want it. And so there's this tugging, because we're so scared of the line. And I go back to, I think it's where we put the line, because it's like, well, there's normal and there's not normal. And if you're not normal, then you're on that road. And if you are normal, stay over here where it's safe. What can we do to stay safe? What can we do to keep our brains okay? And it's like, what can we do what's good for our brains? Again, back to why does there need to be a line? And this idea of diagnosis, and we've now got MCI. See, that sounds safer. Having MCI is so much safer than having a diagnosis of dementia. So maybe it's just MCI. Well, brains figure out pretty quick, if I'm going to go see a professional and they're going to label me, my brain is going to go, okay, babe, suck it up and show well. And so I'm the best I've been in who knows how long, because I've been in medical places and I know that you better show well or they take shit away. And yeah, so that word that just popped out may be the very indicator that I'm struggling to do it, but I can do it for a short window of time. And why do I have to feel that need to do that? Well, because I'll be labeled with the big D or the big A or the big LBD or whatever it is when I show enough symptoms.
You know,
And
I hadn't really thought about that before, Teepa, that one of the barriers to proactivity, as Karen has framed the question, is the notion that to acknowledge a need for a proactive solution is to acknowledge the deficit, right? And so I think what I hear you saying is that the person who's living with dementia or living with MCI or acknowledging some changes is coming to the realization that they need to put their best foot forward in order to not be seen as more disabled or more ill. So that's what the person who's noticing brain changes or living with those brain changes brings to the table. And then I think what the family, friends, and health professionals bring to the table is a desire to uncover the deficit. And so, like, kind of right from the get-go, they're working at slightly cross purposes. And I will hear, and I know Al hears this all the time, we'll hear medical doctors saying they're in denial. Well, the flip side of that is, no, they're actually demonstrating what strengths they have remaining. It's a little different than denial. And denial is given this bad word. So we have, or this bad negative connotation. So there is a tendency, I think, to not recognize the common ground almost right from the get-go. Because if you recognize that, you know, my job is not to uncover what you're hiding, and your job is not to cover up, but both of our jobs is to find your optimal way of living and to see what supports, to see what's in the way of your optimal function. I'll help you figure that out. And then together we figure out how to re-optimize your function, if you will. But I think maybe people bring different frames to that very first table of trying to understand those changes. And that is definitely a training challenge for medical professionals in particular, for health professionals who need to bring more of that, less of an uncovering and more of lining up side by side. I don't know, what do you think, Al? Do you think that's a problem in our education, or?
Yeah, I agree with what both of you say, and I think there's so many complex factors here. I think a lot of it is societal values. I think we have become a very hyper-cognitive, hyper-productive society, and so if you can't quite keep up, you have less value. There's fear behind it because we fear that could happen to us, so we kind of shun it. We don't want to see it. We talked about the assumption of disability that goes with dementia, and I think a lot of what we label denial is actually just that person seeing the slippery slope and knowing that if I give you the car keys, you are soon going to take everything from me. And so I'm going to hold on to those car keys, not because I think I'm a great driver, but because I know that the slippery slope is there. And I got one foot on a banana peel, and I am just hanging on to as much ability to do for myself as possible, because we set society up in the, you know, you're dependent, you're independent. There's none of this idea of working together. But I think you're right. I think the medical profession has not been well trained about how to deliver a diagnosis of dementia, how to paint the reality of dementia within a certain aspect of hope, how to suggest that there is reserve and resilience that people have that we can call on to cope with changes. As I said last year at our conference, I think one of the biggest tragedies that we deny people with dementia is the right to hope. The right to hope that they can continue to live a positive, engaging life. We just seem to take that away. And so I think that a lot of education professionals to really walk side by side with people and not just say, you have X disease, here's your pills, come back in 6 months, which is what happens.
Yeah, you also hit on something that I think is really, really important, and that's what our society values. And we see that now in our conversations around the whole COVID-19 pandemic, and how we're faced with a really, I think, grave and important opportunity to look at some of those societal values. Like, where the value in productivity, and I think you referred to us as hyperproductive and hypercognitive, and we live in this information-rich age, and there is this idea that what we produce as opposed to who we are is wherein lies our value. And that's a really, I was going to say intense, but it is a strongly held societal value, that productivity value. I just wonder what my colleagues, and Karen, you as well, think about. We've talked about taking on the medical profession and the whole education, but what about this broader societal context in which we live, where we tend to dichotomize? We don't seem to recognize that we live in a both and world instead of an either or world, that like there's room for all of us. That's a pretty tall societal order. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, the interesting thing is when you were saying is whether you produce a lot or whether you don't produce a lot. And I would say whether you control a lot, because then we have the controllers of the people who produce. And so the people who are producing are less valued than the controller of the people who produce, because they have what we call power and connections. And power and connections are an interesting phenomena because it's this triangle, and it goes back to when I started thinking about it when Al was speaking and you were talking. We've put physicians in charge of dementia as though the diagnosis is the change. And it's like, well, the change is the change. And the physician might or might not, to be honest, be valuable in determining when the change is enough change, that my life is changing for me to a level where I'm not comfortable in my life as I know it, the environment that I have, the support that I have. I'm not comfortable, and then it's starting to be painful to be in that life as it was, because I don't fit, it doesn't work for me anymore. And we've decided there's a condition that you have when that happens. And I would propose that perhaps the medical diagnosis is really not what we should be focusing on. That we should have physicians do what they're really good at, which is when something isn't going well for me, look and see if there are things that they might provide to me that might be helpful, or the people that are around me, my supports, that would help me live my life well with whatever else I have going on for me and what's happening for me, but not to be used as a weapon against me. When it's time, my behavior's a problem, let's go see the doctor. When the living situation is a problem, let's go see the doctor. When I don't know how to help you, let me go see the doctor. Because very few physicians or healthcare providers, to be honest, rehab people, nurses, really have lived with someone in close proximity. And then, let me say, more than one. Because if you've only lived with one person, you get the mistaken idea that, okay, I know this. I took care of my mom. Well, good, you took care of your mom, and that's great. I admire that. I want to hear that story. That's very helpful. But that was your mom and you in one space, in one life. And so tell me about the other folks in your world that you might have supported in some way, whether they had dementia or not. How have you provided support, and how have you received support from one another so that we could build a fabric that's going to work for someone that's not your mom?
I think that mutuality is really a big part of this, and maybe it gives me some thoughts about my own question with respect to how we further a more mutual society, a society that recognizes that I'm not just the giver, I'm also the receiver, right? It's that mutual support, and we learn from one another with or without dementia. And I think that mutuality is again, something that I keep looking for ways to promote as a member of the society. And so that's, that term mutuality, I think, is what I'm taking from that. Karen?
Well, I wonder if I can push a little bit back on that a little bit and say when, the door to really get into dementia is the diagnosis. I mean, you may be suspecting and seeing things is the medical community. So if they're our first point of, as Al says, education, and they are slow to understand the impact of words, for example, like intervention, are they adding maybe unknowingly, to the pathologizing of people's lives with dementia?
I would step back to the legal community because it is the only condition that I know about that people can take away my rights simply by being around other people that believe like they do and demonstrate something. So you can have a court evaluator go and spend time in my residence and make a decision about me with 1 hour in New York. This is New York for sure, but other places are very similar, if anything. 1 hour court classroom experience and evaluation of how to determine whether a person is competent to make decisions about themselves and their property. And that 1 hour covers mental health issues and dementia.
Well, that's what I was going to say, Teepa. I wish it were restricted to people living with dementia.
It's not. I mean,
it's. We have seen people in so many populations pathologized because of marginalized, stigmatized, because of a label. And so, yeah, I do think that.
So I don't disagree. I mean, I'm not disagreeing that we need to address physicians. I'm just saying, I think the problem actually starts sooner. Because people can get healthcare power of attorney or decision-making proxy by virtue of our legal system right now, and can place against their will because they demonstrate unacceptable or dangerous, quote unquote, conditions. Wisconsin is an example that took a pushback on that and said, that's not okay. We can't just put people in psychiatric settings simply because. But I mean, that to me speaks to the more bedrock issue of this. You're not normal.
And you know, there are also, even way before any court intervention, there are these little, you can call microaggressions that happen every single day, particularly in long-term care, where a family member will say, I want my mother up at this time. I want you to call me and let me know what she had to eat today.
Shower twice a week. She needs to shower twice a week.
And you know, or you know, it's quite normal in the U.S. for someone to call a family member and say, what time do you want to have the care plan? Instead of saying, who would you like at your care plan? You know, and these assumptions that and it's not just dementia, it's old, it's ageism. You know, the stigma around dementia is a subset of ageism. People are seen as less capable just because of age, just because of ability. They move to an environment like assisted living or residential care, and all of a sudden they've lost all these capabilities, and as Teepa says, their rights. They've lost their rights.
Well, I've got a place mom. It's like, we got to place mom rather than, you know, so mom's environment is becoming more challenging. Mom doesn't see it that way. We're noticing it that way. So we're trying to figure out what to do to help mom come to a place that we're more comfortable with. I mean, that's the bottom line of it. We want to be more comfortable with where
you are absolutely right. And it is so reflected in our language, right? I remember when my own mother, who gratefully is 97 and in great health, had a fall some years ago. And the first thing my brother said was, we have to put her somewhere. We have to put her. It's like she was like some object. We will pick her up and place her over there or put her here. And it's been an extraordinary journey with my own family to keep bringing my mom's voice back to the center, where she says, I'll let you know, let's keep talking about what help I need and where I think I can best get it. But even in my own family, it's been really hard to raise awareness and to get them to quit talking about putting in placing, because that is the big one. And I work with my family and friends on this. All of us who are adult children with, you know, aging parents, we're talking adult children in our 60s with aging parents in our 80s and 90s, still adult children talking about putting them somewhere. Can you make my mom understand she has to go? And I say, can I make you understand that she don't have to?
And one of the most frequent questions on any program that I offer is, I need to know how to get her to take a shower. And it's like,
Yes, exactly. How to get somebody else to do my will so I feel better.
Out.
I
Look
hear
at your hand. That is your agenda. That has nothing to do with that individual. There is absolutely no rule written that you gotta dunk them or sprinkle them multiple times a week in order to help someone not have bacteria on their body in selected areas that you have concern about.
Yes.
You know,
You have become my to-do list.
Yeah,
I don't do things to people. I do things with people.
Well, this has been terrific discussion, and we're coming to the end of our discussion time. So I want to wrap it up and give each of you a chance to say something, you know, express what you would like to see change or different, or what is on your agenda going forward to make this a better world in which to live with dementia. And in reverse order, since we started with Susan, Al, we'll start with you, Teepa, then Susan.
Okay, I guess I would like people to continue to see that people living with dementia are the same human beings they've always been. They have developed a medical condition or an injury or something that affects their ability to do certain things, remember certain things. They are still 100% whole people. And just because they have the condition, we shouldn't start making assumptions about what they want or what they need without understanding the world through their eyes as much as possible. And the best way to do that is to engage people, to listen to them, and to really, as Teepa says, I love the image of the fingers. It is we are working with people. We are not doing two, doing four. It's really about empathy, and it's really about understanding that that is a whole person, and looking at the world that way.
Yeah, Teepa.
Well, I think Al said a lot of what I would agree with. I think in addition to that, I would say opening doors and windows, because doors are only one way to go from one place to another, to look from one side to the other, and being willing to step out and go out and be in connection with the willingness to accept things are changing. And with those changes, what's my capacity? And am I okay with being uncomfortable with different? And can I get to a place where different isn't so different anymore? It's just, it's another way of looking at things. And so I have that new ability to do maybe this time this, and maybe this time that, and we see which one works better for us. So coming together with fingers interlocked and moving forward, as opposed to coming together like this, in whatever framework that might be for any individual, organization, or group, I guess is where I'm at.
Thank you.
I guess like my esteemed colleagues, I would like us to go forward recognizing that people living with dementia are people. Full stop. Not people first, not people with dementia, they're people, period. Like me, they have good days and they have bad days. They have goals and dreams and wishes, like I have goals and dreams of wishes. We all have preferences, we have desires. And I like the notion that we go forward in mutual support in achieving those goals and wishes and dreams and desires and upsets, and that we all have something to contribute. I also guess that I would like to see us live with less fear of one another. I think that we do seem to have a lot of fear of differences. And I think we're hopefully going to learn how to applaud differences and sameness. I really hope that we can live recognizing our common humanity, so to speak, and that we recognize that a person living with dementia, that their dementia is not necessarily the most interesting thing about them, that it is like part of who they are, but that there are people who have other really cool attributes and stories, and that we start hearing those stories, and that we recognize our common humanity. I see you, I see our differences, and I see our sameness. And I guess that's my hope for society.
Well, I want to thank each of you. This has been an amazing and a wonderful discussion, and applaud the education, the advocacy work that you each are doing to make this a better world in which to live with dementia. And then end with a special nod to my dad, who I love dearly. And he was the executive director in the 70s and 80s of the American Occupational Therapy Association. So yeah, to connect in earlier, I have a very special place in my heart for you OTs. So thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
My
Bye-bye.
pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Great fun to be with you.
Good to be with everybody.